Tensions around trade are rising again, this time between two major global players, the United States and India. As of late March 2025, a U.S. delegation has landed in New Delhi for a new round of trade talks. These negotiations come at a critical moment, with a looming deadline set by President Donald Trump. On the 2nd of April, he plans to impose what he calls reciprocal tariffs on countries with whom the U.S. has a significant trade imbalance, and India is high on that list. The delegation, led by Brendan Lynch, the Assistant United States Trade Representative for South and Central Asia, arrived in India earlier this week. According to a statement from the U.S. Embassy, the visit is meant to underline America's ongoing commitment to building a productive and balanced trade relationship with India. It sounds diplomatic, but behind that careful language is a fair bit of pressure. Trump's tariff deadline is putting countries like India in a tight spot. Over the past few years, India and the U.S. have gone back and forth on trade issues, sometimes quietly, sometimes not so much. While both countries say they're interested in deeper economic cooperation, the numbers tell a more complicated story. India currently enjoys a trade surplus of around $45 billion with the United States. That means India exports far more to the U.S. than it imports. While this might sound like good news for India, it has become a point of tension in Washington. President Trump has often pointed to this surplus as unfair, and in his usual style, hasn't held back in his criticism. He's referred to India as a tariff king and accused it of being a big abuser of global trade rules. One of the key concerns for the Trump administration is the average level of tariffs India imposes on imported goods. On average, Indian tariffs stand at around 12%, far higher than the roughly 2% average on American imports. This has become one of the main talking points for Trump, especially as he pushes for more balanced trade terms under his America First approach. Back in the Indian capital, officials are trying to strike a more optimistic note. India's Junior Commerce Minister, Jitin Prasada, told Parliament that both sides are working on a broader trade agreement. This potential deal is expected to cover several sectors and focus on easing market access, while also reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers. Essentially, both countries are trying to create a smoother pathway for their goods and services to flow back and forth without too many roadblocks. These current talks in Delhi aren't happening in isolation. They're part of a series of high-level discussions that have picked up pace since Trump returned to office. In February, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a visit to Washington. Following that, India's Trade Minister Piyush Goyal made an unscheduled trip to the U.S. in March, hinting at the urgency behind the scenes. One of the more immediate goals is to finalize the first phase of a new trade agreement by autumn 2025. This would ideally be a stepping stone towards the much bigger target, increasing the volume of U.S.-India trade from the current $190 billion to an ambitious $500 billion. That's a big jump. And while both sides say they want it, getting there won't be simple. While the exact contents of the current negotiations remain under wraps, reports from Reuters suggest that India might be willing to make significant concessions. According to these reports, the Indian government is considering slashing tariffs on more than half of all U.S. imports, a move that would impact around $23 billion worth of trade. The aim here is clear: to avoid the upcoming retaliatory tariffs Trump has threatened. Now, this idea of reciprocal tariffs, or tit-for-tat measures, is something Trump has been vocal about for years. The concept is straightforward. If another country charges the U.S. a certain percentage on its exports, then the U.S. should charge the same rate in return. But in practice, the policy is harder to implement and could have unintended consequences, especially for long-standing allies. Interestingly, in recent comments, Trump appeared to soften his stance a little. He hinted that the White House might not be as rigid as once thought. Speaking earlier this week, he said, "We may take less than what they're charging. Because they've charged us so much, I don't think they could take it." He also noted that some countries might be spared from the full extent of the tariffs. This uncertainty about the exact measures makes it harder for countries like India to plan ahead. For businesses and investors, that unpredictability can be just as challenging as the tariffs themselves. A trade policy that changes week to week can slow down investment, disrupt supply chains, and increase the cost of doing business. It's also worth noting that trade is just one part of the broader US-India relationship. The two countries have been deepening their defense and strategic ties in recent years, with shared concerns about China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific region. These security links add another layer to the current talks. Neither side wants to jeopardize progress in other areas over a trade dispute. Still, economics matters. And for India, access to the massive US market is crucial, especially as it tries to position itself as a global manufacturing hub. Over the last few years, India has introduced several policy changes aimed at attracting foreign investment and simplifying trade. Lowering tariffs on American goods might be a politically sensitive move, but it could also open the door for more US businesses to invest in India, creating jobs and driving growth. On the American side, there's also an incentive to find common ground. India is a fast-growing economy with a huge consumer base, and US companies want in. Smoother trade ties could benefit American exporters, especially in areas like agriculture, medical devices, energy, and tech. But of course, the political climate makes it hard to predict how things will unfold. With Trump's April 2nd deadline fast approaching, negotiators are under pressure to show progress, or at least signal a willingness to compromise. The risk of tariffs looms large, and both sides are aware that failure to strike a deal could set off a fresh wave of economic tensions. A new announcement came just days before the president's wider plan to implement reciprocal tariffs is due to take effect on the 2nd of April. These broader tariffs target countries with trade imbalances or high duties on US goods. But the Venezuela-specific measure stands out for a different reason. It's aimed at punishing not just Venezuela itself, but any country that continues to buy its oil. Trump has proposed a 25% tariff on US imports from countries that purchase oil from Venezuela. This includes some major global players like China, India, and Spain. According to Trump, this isn't just about trade. It's about holding the Venezuelan government accountable for what he describes as numerous reasons, including the claim that Venezuela has been deliberately sending gang members into the United States. The president's rhetoric around Venezuela isn't new. His administration has taken a tough stance on the South American country for several years, citing its authoritarian leadership, economic mismanagement, and human rights issues. But what is new is the method. By threatening tariffs on Venezuela's oil customers, the U.S. is expanding its strategy from direct sanctions to indirect economic pressure, essentially targeting the buyers, not just the seller. While the stated intention is to isolate the Venezuelan government and limit its financial lifelines, the actual impact could be far more complex. For instance, China is one of Venezuela's top oil buyers, but Venezuelan crude makes up a relatively small percentage of China's total oil imports. India is another significant buyer, and so is Spain, although on a smaller scale. All three countries now face a difficult choice: reduce or halt their Venezuelan oil purchases, or risk higher tariffs on their own exports to the U.S. Trump's tariff threats come at a time of broader uncertainty about U.S. trade policy. While he's continued to push the idea of reciprocal tariffs, where the U.S. matches the import duties imposed by other countries, there are signs that his administration might be reconsidering just how tough to be. In comments made earlier this week, Trump suggested that the White House may not go as far as originally planned. He said, "We may take less than what they're charging. Because they've charged us so much, I don't think they could take it." This comment was interpreted by many analysts as a potential softening of his stance. Trump also hinted that some countries might be exempt from the harshest measures, depending on their strategic importance or willingness to negotiate. This sort of unpredictability is becoming a hallmark of his trade strategy, sometimes signaling a hardline approach, and other times offering what sounds like an olive branch. The market reacted quickly to these mixed messages. After weeks of declines driven by fears of a trade war, all three major U.S. share indexes closed higher following the president's remarks. The S&P 500 gained 1.7%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose by 1.2%, and the Nasdaq jumped by 2.2%. Investors seemed relieved that the tariffs might not be as widespread or severe as initially feared. Still, it's clear that Trump's use of tariffs has expanded far beyond traditional trade disputes. Since taking office, he has used them, or threatened to use them, as leverage in a wide range of conflicts, some of which have little to do with trade itself. From immigration issues at the southern border to military alliances and now foreign policy challenges in Latin America, tariffs have become a go-to instrument for pressure and persuasion. The president confirmed that he still plans to move ahead with tariffs on specific goods such as cars, lumber, and computer chips. His argument is that the possibility of these tariffs is already encouraging companies to invest more within the United States. Whether or not that proves to be true in the long run remains to be seen, but for now, it's a central pillar of his economic policy. The focus on Venezuela also intersects with other recent decisions. Earlier this year, Trump canceled an oil deal that had allowed limited U.S. engagement with Venezuela's energy sector. That move was seen as a major blow to the already struggling Venezuelan economy. And more recently, the U.S. resumed deportations to Venezuela after a brief pause, citing renewed concerns over public safety and national security. Chevron, one of the few U.S. oil firms allowed to operate in Venezuela due to exemptions from economic sanctions, is now under pressure too. The administration recently extended the deadline for Chevron to wind down its operations in Venezuela until the 27th of May. While the company declined to comment publicly, the message is clear. The window for doing business in Venezuela is closing fast. Oil prices reacted accordingly, rising more than 1% after the announcement of the potential new tariffs. That spike reflects market fears of reduced supply, increased geopolitical risk, and the potential for broader disruptions in global oil flows. For Venezuela, these new threats are yet another challenge in a long list of economic pressures. The country is already dealing with hyperinflation, widespread shortages, and political instability. Its oil industry, once one of the most powerful in the world, is now a shadow of its former self. Yet, oil remains one of the few reliable sources of income for the Venezuelan government. Cutting off access to major buyers like China and India would be a severe economic blow. And while the Venezuelan government has few options for retaliation, the countries targeted by the new U.S. tariffs do. China, in particular, has already been caught in a broader trade war with the United States, and adding this new layer of complexity could further strain relations. India, on the other hand, is trying to maintain strong ties with both the U.S. and Venezuela, especially as it navigates its own economic goals and energy needs. In the industrial town of Sriperumbudur, in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu, you'll find rows of employment agencies and dormitories filled with young women who've traveled from villages across India, all in search of steady work. Many of them end up at the local Foxconn plant, where iPhones are made. Some arrive on overnight buses, uncertain of the exact job they'll be offered, but confident it will pay better than the garment factories they're leaving behind. This is the human face of a much larger story, one that connects shifting global alliances, trade disputes, and the changing landscape of global manufacturing. As the United States under President Donald Trump takes a tougher line on China, especially through tariffs and trade restrictions, India is hoping to take advantage. The country sees a unique opportunity to position itself as the next big hub for global manufacturing. It's a strategy that's been gaining momentum over the past few years. During the pandemic and its aftermath, concern grew around the world about relying too heavily on China for essential goods, from electronics to pharmaceuticals. Many countries started talking about the need to diversify supply chains, and India has worked hard to present itself as a strong alternative. For India, attracting global manufacturers is about more than just economic growth. It's about jobs, particularly for women. In Tamil Nadu alone, more than 40% of all female factory workers in India are employed, even though the state makes up just 6% of the country's population. That's no coincidence. Tamil Nadu is known for its relatively smooth bureaucracy and efficient local governance, especially when compared to other Indian states, and that makes it a favorite for companies looking to invest. The town of Sriperumbudur has already attracted major multinational companies. Foxconn, one of Apple's primary suppliers, shifted parts of its iPhone production from China to India in 2017. That move was seen at the time as part of Apple's strategy to diversify its supply chain. Today, India manufactures about 15% of all iPhones globally. The country has ambitions to push that figure up to 25% in the near future. This shift is having a major impact on people's lives. For young workers like Kirthana, who recently arrived in Sriperumbudur from a small town, the promise of a factory job means financial independence and the ability to support her family. She was told she'd earn the equivalent of $170 a month, double what she used to make sewing clothes in her hometown. It's not a fortune by global standards, but it's enough to change lives in communities where job opportunities, especially for women, are limited. For policymakers and economists, this sort of transformation is one of the strongest arguments in favor of India's manufacturing push. Former Indian government advisor Arvind Subramanian says he supports manufacturing unambiguously because of its power to lift women out of poverty and into the workforce. This context is important as India looks to ride the wave of anti-China sentiment and tariff policies coming out of Washington. The idea is simple. If it's becoming more expensive for companies to operate in China due to American tariffs, then those companies will look for alternatives. India, with its large workforce, improving infrastructure, and growing consumer market, hopes to be at the top of that list. That hope got a major boost during Trump's first term. As relations between the US and China soured, India found itself in a stronger position to attract foreign investment. Even after the Biden administration took office, many of the Trump-era tariffs remained in place, and some were even expanded. Through it all, India quietly continued to benefit. But in recent months, things have become more complicated. Although Trump campaigned on imposing tariffs as high as 60% on Chinese imports, his administration has only implemented 20% tariffs so far. That's still significant, but it's less aggressive than what many analysts and Indian officials were expecting, and that has raised concerns in India. Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor at The Hindu, explains it like this. Indian officials were hoping that the US would take a harder line on China. The tougher the US position, the more likely companies would be to look for manufacturing options outside China. That hasn't happened at the scale India hoped for. Ashutosh Varshney, who directs the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown University, believes part of the reason for this softer stance could be down to people like Elon Musk. Musk's companies, including Tesla, have strong ties to China, and he now holds significant influence in the Trump administration. That could be shaping the White House's approach to tariffs and business with Beijing. So while India is still attracting new business, it's not experiencing the kind of dramatic shift it had anticipated. And it doesn't help that India's own trade relationship with the US has its issues. America is India's largest trading partner, but the relationship is far from balanced. India had a $45 billion trade surplus with the US last year, and Washington has made it clear that this needs to change. One of the major sticking points is India's high tariffs on imported goods. According to the United States Trade Representative's 2024 report, India imposes some of the highest tariffs of any major economy. Duties range from 45% on vegetable oils to as high as 150% on alcoholic beverages. Even coffee is taxed at around 100%. This hasn't gone unnoticed in Washington. During his recent State of the Union address, President Trump reiterated that reciprocal tariffs on India and other countries would begin on the 2nd of April. If those go ahead, analysts say India could lose as much as $7 billion in trade with the US, according to estimates from Citigroup reported by Reuters. That potential loss is causing concern, not just in Delhi, but in state capitals like Chennai, which governs Tamil Nadu. Even so, local officials say there are reasons to be hopeful. A senior Tamil Nadu government representative, speaking anonymously due to political sensitivities, told NPR that companies will likely continue investing in India regardless of tariffs. The bigger factor, he said, is the desire to diversify supply chains and gain access to a large and growing consumer market. But even he admitted that what hurts investment more than bad policy is uncertainty. Businesses want stability. They want to know what the rules are going to be next week, next month, and next year. With Trump's frequent policy shifts and tariff threats, that kind of predictability is hard to come by. The broader challenge for India is clear. On one hand, it wants to benefit from the changing global trade environment. On the other, it needs to manage its own economic priorities, protecting key industries, managing domestic employment, and staying on good terms with major partners like the U.S. Meanwhile, ordinary people like Kirthana are just looking for steady work and a chance at a better life. In many ways, the future of global trade, geopolitics, and economics will come down to the choices made in places like Sriperumbudur, where the world's shifting priorities are playing out in real time on factory floors. A larger wave of tariffs could come into effect on April 2nd, adding more pressure on Canada's already strained industrial sectors. For companies that rely heavily on exports to the United States, these new measures have created immediate uncertainty and financial strain. The United Steelworkers Union, which represents more than 225,000 private sector workers in Canada, says at least 200 members have already lost their jobs. Some of the hardest-hit companies include Canada Metal Processing Group, which recently announced a workforce reduction of 140 employees. The company cited, among other reasons, the threat of U.S. tariffs as a key factor in its decision. That threat has now become a reality. In Ontario, Algoma Steel has also been affected. The company has laid off at least 20 workers so far, and may need to make further cuts if it's unable to find new Canadian buyers to replace lost U.S. customers. Company leaders have said they're doing what they can to avoid more layoffs, but the outlook remains uncertain. The Canadian government has acknowledged the severity of the situation. Labour Minister Stephen McKinnon was unavailable for comment, but a government spokesperson said Canada is closely monitoring the impact of U.S. tariffs and will introduce additional support measures if needed. Prime Minister Mark Carney, just days before calling a federal election, announced new policies to give workers earlier access to employment insurance. A broader aid package for affected businesses is also in the works. Workers like Scott Noseworthy, who has spent 4 years as a shredder operator at a steel plant in Eastern Ontario, say the sudden change has been hard to absorb. He explained how employees were warned of possible layoffs weeks in advance, but hoped the tariffs would be avoided. Now, with the measures in place, his team is temporarily back at work doing maintenance and cleanup. But what happens after that remains unclear. The uncertainty is taking a toll not just on workers, but on the broader economy. Economists say that as tariffs remain in place, their impact will likely ripple through other sectors, especially smaller subcontractors and companies tied to import and export activity. Some advocates are now pushing for broader reforms to Canada's employment insurance system, suggesting that more people need access to longer and more secure support during difficult periods. Canada is the United States' top supplier of steel, which makes this dispute particularly significant. With a 30-day grace period set to expire soon for certain goods under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, the fear is that even more layoffs could be around the corner. The head of the United Steelworkers Union has warned that up to 100,000 Canadian workers could be affected if no resolution is reached.